He plummeted from a height exceeding 30 feet, with no safety harness and no one to break his descent. Everyone presumed him deceased until witnessing the force that arrested his fall. In that precise instant, even those who hadn't offered a prayer in decades fell into a profound silence. On the far southern reaches of New Mexico, where the stark desert landscape merges with the distant horizon, and where silence resonates more powerfully than any sermon, lies a town so diminutive it often escapes cartographic representation. Yet, for the inhabitants of Las Pedras, it was their cherished home. A tranquil settlement characterized by its sun-baked roads, weathered signage, and a solitary decaying church whose bells had remained mute for more than 2 years. Each morning, preceding the dawn's first light, while most dwellings remained enshrouded in slumber and the cacti stood like stoic sentinels beneath the starlit sky, one porch lamp invariably illuminated the darkness first. Joseph Martinez, a man of 53 years, awakened not to the shrill summons of an alarm, but by the ingrained rhythm of habit, a deep sense of duty, and a silent communion he maintained daily with an absent presence. Within his humble trailer home, situated at the town's periphery, where the roof conceded to summer downpours and the floorboards groaned under the weight of weary footsteps, Joseph ignited a single candle before a modest shrine meticulously constructed in a corner of his kitchen. There, amidst faded photographs and well-worn tools, stood a small, laminated image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, its surface cracked but its significance indelible. Each morning he would gently touch it, placing his hand just above his heart, murmuring a singular, heartfelt plea. "Keep me safe today, and watch over my children." Joseph was not a man of elaborate pronouncements. He was a craftsman. His hands bore the calluses of arduous labor, his skin the deep tan of constant exposure to the sun. A man who had known the biting pangs of hunger and the profound ache of loss far more intimately than the joys of celebration. His wife, Martia, had succumbed to cancer 4 winters prior. Since her passing, the responsibility of raising their 2 teenage children alone had become his new, all-consuming occupation, superimposed upon the demands of mixing concrete, ascending scaffolding, and mending roofs under the relentless desert sun. The residents of Las Pedras affectionately referred to him as El Albañil Viejo, the old builder, not out of derision, but profound respect. He toiled with a vigor that surpassed men half his age. He never missed the Sunday liturgy, even when occupying the back pew in his dust-covered jeans, his eyes reflecting a deep weariness. And though his earnings were meager, barely sufficient for sustenance, he never sought assistance. When the town's sole Catholic edifice, St. Anthony's, was ravaged by a fierce dust storm 2 years earlier, its roof caved in, its stained glass windows shattered, and with them, the very spirit of the community seemed to crumble. No one dared to approach the devastated structure. It lay abandoned, resembling a hallowed tomb, cordoned off by caution tape and an oppressive silence. Joseph, however, perceived it differently. He accepted a task that everyone else shunned, not for the remuneration, which was negligible, but because an inner voice compelled him, insisting it must be done. "You don't reconstruct churches with money," he once confided to the proprietor of the local general store. "You rebuild them with faith." Each morning, following his quiet devotion, Joseph would pack the same essential items: a weathered tool belt, a sandwich meticulously wrapped in paper by his daughter, and the familiar small photograph of the Virgin Mary, carefully tucked into the breast pocket of his flannel work shirt. He never departed his home without it. It was an unwavering ritual. To those unfamiliar with him, he was merely another construction worker. To the locals, however, he represented far more. "That man builds with more than just bricks," remarked Mrs. Delgado, the town's baker. "He builds with devotion." Even Father Thomas, the aging parish priest, who had once despaired of St. Anthony's ever being restored, quietly conceded, "Joseph isn't merely rebuilding walls, He's restoring what we've lost internally. Yet, what remained unknown to his children, the priest, and indeed, even to Joseph himself, was that a moment was fast approaching that would test the very fabric of his being. A single, terrifying instant that would hurl him from the heavens, only to be caught in a manner that defied the very laws of gravity, logic, and even the finality of death. And that pivotal moment would commence with a whisper of wind and the ominous creak of scaffolding. There was nothing ostentatious about Joseph Martinez's existence, yet there was an undeniably sacred quality to the manner in which he navigated life. He possessed no vehicle newer than the 1996 model that coughed audibly with every ignition, nor did he have substantial savings, cable television, or the leisure time to simply observe the world drift by. However, every brick he meticulously placed, every timber he secured with nails, carried a profound sense of devotion, a quality most individuals reserved solely for Sunday mornings. His days commenced early, unfailingly, not from any external obligation, but from a deeply held conviction that God was already awake, and to keep him waiting would be an act of discourtesy. At 5:15 in the morning, while the desert's residual chill still clung to the earth, and the distant calls of coyotes echoed faintly, Joseph was already at the stove, preparing coffee. He poured a cup for himself and another, placing it near the photograph of his late wife, Martia. This was a ritual born not of lingering grief, but of a love that refused to be diminished by the passage of time. His two children, Isabel, 16 years of age, and Mateo, 13, were accustomed to rousing themselves to the sound of his boots traversing the floor and the scratch of a pencil as he meticulously jotted down his daily work schedule on the reverse side of discarded receipts. They understood that their father was a man of few words, but when he offered a smile after a day of strenuous labor, it signified that they possessed all they could ever need. The kitchen was modest, furnished with second-hand pieces, and the refrigerator door was adorned with fading report cards, children's drawings, and a single sticky note bearing the inscription, "Faith isn't what you say. It's what you keep doing when no one's watching." Isabel had penned this after overhearing her father articulate a similar sentiment. In the glove compartment of his aged pickup truck, a rosary was always present, its wooden beads worn smooth by the ceaseless touch of anxious fingers over many years. His toolbox contained not only an assortment of nails and pliers, but also a small tin case holding two precious items, a folded prayer card of St. Joseph the Worker, and that same photograph of Our Lady of Guadalupe, flattened and laminated, its edges tinged yellow from sweat and sunlight. The townsfolk often remarked that Joseph worked as if divinely guided from above, and perhaps he was. He never spoke openly about his religious convictions. He neither preached nor offered unsolicited corrections. However, should anyone inquire why he would softly murmur something under his breath before ascending scaffolding, he would simply tap the left side of his chest and reply, "That's between me and her." When word spread that St. Anthony's Church was finally undergoing repairs, most assumed a prominent construction firm had secured the contract, but no, it was Joseph, just Joseph, working diligently, piece by piece, receiving no payment beyond a few sandwiches delivered by neighbors and the occasional chilled bottle of water left on a ledge. Every afternoon, as the heat intensified and the tools became too hot to handle, Joseph would remove his cap, wipe the perspiration from his brow, and cast his gaze toward the unfinished cross still leaning precariously atop the church's facade. He uttered no words, but his eyes conveyed a profound message. To him, the reconstruction of the church was not merely about mortar and brick. It was about restoring something that no insurance policy could ever compensate for: hope. "Dad's not a superhero," Isabel once confided to a friend at school, "but I think he carries a prayer in his pocket instead of a wallet." And it was true. That small photograph in his pocket was more than mere paper. It was a shield, a cherished memory, a sacred promise. No one observed the increasing instability of the scaffolding he climbed daily, nor the subtle limp that began to affect Joseph's left leg after prolonged periods of work. He never voiced a complaint. He simply slowed his gait and extended his prayers before resuming his task. With each sunset, as lengthening shadows stretched across the church's foundation, Joseph would pack his tools, touch the photograph one final time, and whisper, "Gracias." Not because the day had been effortless, but because he had been granted protection yet again. However, safety, much like faith, does not always arrive without undergoing a trial, and Joseph's trial was but a single morning away. It was a Wednesday morning in early April. The sky above Las Pedras was exceptionally clear, an almost achingly vivid blue, and the sun had already begun to bake the earth by 9 o'clock. Fine grit coated the air, and the heat was so intense that it seemed to make the metal groan and the wind feel dry enough to crack one's lips. Joseph Martinez had arrived before anyone else, as was his custom. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and his worn work shirt was already stained with sweat across the chest, precisely over the spot where the image of the Virgin Mary rested in his pocket, close to his heart. Today was the day he was scheduled to inspect the uppermost section of the bell tower scaffolding, the most elevated and exposed point of the entire restoration project. The church's crossbeam remained above it, crooked and unanchored, a symbol awaiting its redemption. Ordinarily, he would have dispatched one of the younger workers for this task. Luis, the college student assisting for the summer, had offered his services, as had Diego, a local high school senior seeking to earn some extra money. However, Joseph declined. "No," he stated, adjusting his gloves. "This one is my responsibility. I cannot allow anyone else to bear what I pledged to complete." No one argued. He possessed that familiar look of quiet determination that compelled even the most skeptical to step aside. From the ground below, Father Thomas watched with evident anxiety, his arms crossed over his chest, his lips silently forming the words of a Hail Mary. Isabel, Joseph's daughter, had brought him his midday meal and stood near the pickup truck, entirely unaware that she was about to witness an event she would forever remember. Joseph ascended slowly, not from fear, but from a profound respect for each rung, as if it were sacred ground. At the apex, the scaffolding swayed gently in the breeze. Metal groaned, and wood shifted, but his concentration remained unwavering. He crouched down, tested the anchor bolts with a wrench, adjusted the base of the cross, and gently ran his hand across the unworked stone. A craftsman's benediction. Then, a singular sound altered everything. A sharp metallic snap, abrupt and dry, like the crack of a whip through the pervasive silence. From below, Luis was the first to cry out. "Mr. Martinez, the bar is coming loose." Joseph stood up abruptly, far too quickly. One of the platform's guardrails buckled beneath him. His right foot slipped on the accumulated dust and gravel, and in an instant he was airborne. Isabel dropped her sandwich. Father Tomas gasped. Luis rushed forward. Time itself seemed to fracture. To those observing, it felt as though the very earth had momentarily ceased its rotation to bear witness to what transpired next. Joseph's body twisted unnaturally in midair, his arms flailing in a primal reflex, his eyes wide with shock but devoid of a cry. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He was falling from a height of over 30 feet, head first, towards the unforgiving concrete below. There was no safety harness, no net, nothing tangible except a single, forgotten tarp that had been loosely tied between two poles the previous day, intended solely to shield the workers from the sun. Incredibly, at that very moment, as the wind unexpectedly picked up, the tarp caught the air and billowed upwards slightly, resembling a sail unfurling to embrace a gust. Joseph's trajectory carried him directly onto it. The fabric yielded under his weight, but it slowed his descent just enough for him to land not on the hard concrete, but upon a mound of old cement bags and a heap of discarded sand. It was neither soft nor clean, but it provided just enough cushioning to preserve his life. He did not rebound. He did not cry out. He simply lay there, utterly still, his shirt torn across his chest, a trickle of blood flowing from his forehead. The sight was catastrophic. Luis vaulted the fence. Father Tomas fell to his knees. Isabel sprinted forward, crying out his name, "Dad! Dad!" They pulled the tarp aside. Isabel reached him first, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his neck. He was breathing, shallowly, but his breath was real. Then she saw it, the photograph, that aged image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, laminated and worn by time, was split precisely down the middle. Torn during the fall, and imprinted across Joseph's chest was a bruise, circular in shape and identical in size to the image. Isabel could not utter a sound. She clutched the two pieces of the photograph as if they were fragile glass. Luis whispered, his voice filled with awe. That thing stopped him. I swear it." Even the paramedic, arriving minutes later, muttered under his breath, "You don't fall from that height and survive unless someone caught you." Joseph did not regain consciousness that day, but he did not succumb to his injuries either. And for the first time in years, the people of Las Pedras directed their gaze not towards their phones or their daily schedules, but upwards. Because something inexplicable had transpired, and deep within their hearts, they all understood that it was not mere chance. It was a benevolent intervention, a moment of pause, an act of mercy, and it carried a name. By the time the sun began to set that day, the news had already traveled far beyond the construction site, beyond the church, beyond anything Joseph Martinez would have ever desired public attention for. "He fell," people whispered in gas stations and grocery store aisles. He fell, and he didn't die. But it was not solely his survival that astonished the community of Las Pedras. It was the manner of his survival. The tarp, the heap of cement bags, the desecrated image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, now in two pieces, still bearing a peculiar indentation near his heart. It was all too precise, too aligned, too divinely orchestrated. No one dared to utter the word miracle aloud, at least not yet. Yet something had undeniably shifted. In a town where church attendance had dwindled year after year, and the broken bell of St. Anthony's had long fallen silent, the inhabitants began to stir once more, not out of routine, but out of a newfound reverence. The following morning, even before the sun had crested the hills, someone placed a candle at the site where Joseph had landed. An hour later, another individual arrived, this time with a rosary, gently looping it around a stray piece of scaffolding. Subsequently, a mother brought flowers, delicate white lilies from her own garden. Then a grandfather brought his grandson, simply to stand there in quiet contemplation. By the third day, a small congregation had gathered around the mound of sand where the tarp had cradled Joseph's fall. They spoke little. No one had organized this gathering, yet people arrived spontaneously, drawn by an inexplicable force. A woman who had not attended church in 15 years was observed lighting a candle, tears streaming down her face. A teenage boy, who had previously scoffed at religious observances, was caught with his hands folded in prayer, seemingly without conscious thought. Even Father Tomas, who had served the parish for over 3 decades, confessed to the bishop later, "I did not initiate this. They arrived of their own accord. They came because they witnessed something that none of us could articulate through sermons." Meanwhile, Joseph had still not opened his eyes. He lay in a hospital room in a neighboring town, bandaged and bruised, his heartbeat steady but weak. A nurse, Maria Delgado, quietly placed the torn photograph of the Virgin beside his bed after Isabel requested it be kept near. Each day, more individuals arrived at the ruins of St. Anthony's, not to work, but simply to observe. They brought folding chairs, erected their own umbrellas for shade, and commenced what some referred to as the silent rosary. There were no announcements, no choir, only people engaged in prayer. By the end of the week, the area surrounding the site of the fall had transformed into a makeshift shrine. Chalk crosses marked the ground. Candles had melted into the cracks of the pavement, and scraps of paper bearing handwritten prayers were affixed beneath bricks. One poignant note read, "If you caught him, perhaps you can catch me too, Mr. Rivera." The owner of the town's hardware store, who had long abandoned his faith after the tragic loss of his son in a car accident, donated fresh lumber and concrete mix, remarking, "I don't believe in miracles, but I believe in what this is doing for people." Even the mayor made an unannounced, unaccompanied appearance, stood in silent contemplation for 10 minutes, and then departed with red-rimmed eyes and no comment. At one juncture, a camera crew from Santa Fe arrived to capture footage but departed within an hour. "They are not looking for news," the producer stated. "They are protecting something." And indeed they were, for what had once been a construction site had metamorphosed into sacred ground. No one claimed ownership, no one imposed rules, yet everyone understood. Something holy had transpired here. The transformation was not ostentatious or dramatic. It was subtle, like the gentle return of breath after profound sorrow, like grace descending amidst dust, sunlight, and silence. People began returning to Mass, parents bringing their reluctant teenagers. Neighbors who had been estranged for years now shared pews. The bell tower remained silent, but something far deeper had been profoundly stirred. Within the hospital, on the 7th night since the incident, Joseph stirred for the first time. He did not speak. He did not rise, but his hand moved instinctively towards his chest. Slowly, weakly, he reached for the place where the photograph had once rested. Maria, the nurse, gasped. She placed the torn image into his fingers. His thumb traced the crease, and for the first time since his fall, a faint smile touched his lips. In Las Pedras, there was no need for sensational headlines, no requirement for official pronouncements from the church, not even Joseph's personal testimony. They had witnessed it collectively. And for the first time in a considerable period, they believed together. Joseph Martinez returned to the restoration site, not with a hammer in his hand, but with a folding chair, a faded notepad, and a gaze that held more quiet introspection than spoken words. Medical professionals had cautioned him. His ribs were still mending, and his left arm lacked its full strength. Yet his heart, fragile as it was, seemed to propel him forward each morning, even if his steps moved with a diminished cadence. He no longer climbed. He no longer lifted bags of concrete or measured support beams. Instead, he would arrive to sit in the shade of the partially constructed bell tower. Often before the sun had fully risen, a thermos of coffee beside him, a notebook resting on his lap, and the worn image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, now mended with tape, placed gently on a nearby crate like a cherished companion. No one questioned his presence. Everyone understood the unspoken reason. Then, one morning, a peculiar event unfolded. Joseph did not occupy his usual spot. Instead, he carried 3 red bricks within a plastic container and placed them on the dusty ground near the location where he had fallen. He knelt slowly, with evident pain, and pressed one brick firmly into the earth, followed by a second and then a third. Father Thomas, who had arrived to deliver Joseph a sandwich, stood frozen, observing the scene. "Joe," he inquired, "what are you building?" Joseph did not look up. He simply replied in a whisper, "She caught me. Now I'm building her a place to rest." This was not a grand proclamation. It was not shared on social media, nor was it mentioned in the church bulletin. Yet, somehow, everyone became aware. The following day, Luis, the college student who had assisted with the restoration, appeared with a bag of mortar. The day after that, Mr. Rivera contributed a sack of unused cement from his garage. By the end of the week, 15 different individuals had delivered materials to the vicinity of Joseph's bricks. Some left them discreetly under the cover of night, while others handed them over with trembling hands and no words exchanged. Initially, no one referred to it as an altar. They simply called it Joe's spot. And Joe continued to build. Not high, not wide, but with a precision that only faith can dictate. He placed each brick as if it held a person's name, and perhaps it did. Because each time he completed a row, he would pause, lower his head, and speak softly, so softly that only the wind could discern his words. Some believed he was praying, others thought he was reminiscing, but all agreed that this was not mere construction. It was an act of profound devotion. A woman named Elena, whose daughter had struggled with depression for years, brought a small ceramic statue of Mary, the kind one might find in a roadside curio shop, its base chipped but still intact. She placed it gently upon the third layer of bricks. Joseph regarded it for a considerable time before nodding and saying, "She is home." No one offered design suggestions, nor did anyone propose plaster, marble, or gold, for this was not a shrine intended for public display or media attention. It was a heartfelt expression of gratitude, constructed with the resources readily available, not with idealized wishes. Children arrived and drew vibrant chalk hearts on the surrounding stones. Elderly men stood in quiet contemplation, removing their hats. Teenagers, who had once disparaged matters of faith, now returned simply to leave wildflowers in tin cans. The altar gradually ascended, reaching only waist height. It possessed no roof, no adornments, only a simple wooden bench beside it, which Joseph himself meticulously sanded and painted. One afternoon, under a sky painted with the hues of a setting sun, he carved 7 words onto that bench. "Where grace caught me, she will rest." One morning, Father Tomas found him seated beside the completed altar, his fingers dusted with brick particles. The photograph of Mary lay beside him, now enclosed within a protective glass frame. "Why here?" the priest inquired. "Why not wait for the church to be finished and place her inside properly?" Joseph gazed at the bricks, his voice low but steady. "Because this is where she found me. And you do not forget the place where heaven reached down and held you aloft." By then, no one questioned his actions. The altar was no longer solely his. It had become a sanctuary for the entire town, a place where sorrow was transmuted into peace, where unanswered questions found solace. Some came to weep, some to kneel in supplication, and others merely to sit, to breathe, and to feel a presence they hadn't experienced in a long time. Over time, that small square of bricks, with its uneven edges and sun-faded statue, became the most frequented location in Las Pedras. It wasn't about the appearance, but the substance it contained. A singular moment, an enigma, and a man who expressed his gratitude by constructing something that could never truly be repaid. As summer waned, Joseph Martinez began to walk with a more measured gait and a shallower breath. The intense desert heat, which once seemed to roll off his back, now felt as though it permeated his very bones. His left hand would tremble when he reached for his coffee cup. His knees would emit audible clicks each time he rose from the weathered wooden bench situated near the altar. Yet he persisted in his daily visits. The local inhabitants claimed they could synchronize their timepieces with his arrival. Just prior to the first light of dawn, Joseph's recognizable silhouette would emerge along the dusty pathway that meandered towards the altar of gratitude, a place that had evolved into a revered sanctuary for a significant portion of the town. However, what remained unseen was the increasing difficulty he faced in simply getting out of bed. His daughter, Isabel, was the first to perceive these subtle changes. He would struggle to exit the truck. He would remain seated for extended periods on the porch. At times, in the midst of a conversation, his gaze would wander, not out of distraction, but from sheer exhaustion. "You require rest, Dad," she would often whisper. But Joseph would simply offer a smile, place a hand over his heart, near the ever-present image of Mary, and respond, "There's still something I need to complete." He was no longer referring to the construction of physical structures. One Tuesday morning, Louise, a college student who had returned to their hometown for the summer, observed a transformation. Joseph was not engaged in laying bricks. Instead, he was writing. A small, unassuming notebook lay open on the bench beside him. Traces of blue ink smudged the edges. His pen was held with a firm grip, despite the noticeable tremor in his fingers. Luis, after a moment of hesitation, inquired, "Mr. Martinez, what is it that you are working on?" Joseph did not look up. He paused for a beat, then simply stated, "A different kind of foundation." It was neither a personal journal nor a correspondence. It was something entirely distinct. The pages were unadorned by dates. They did not commence with a salutation nor conclude with a formal closing. Each inscription resembled a hushed whisper, a captured memory, a contemplative reflection, or a heartfelt prayer. Some entries were concise. "She didn't rescue me to make me a hero. She apprehended me to serve as a reminder that she still observes us." Others were more expansive. "When I was a young boy, I believed miracles manifested with thunderous displays and angelic choirs. It transpires they occasionally arrive on tranquil mornings, concealed within tarps and a veil of dust." Over the ensuing weeks, the notebook steadily filled. Observers began to note that Joseph was no longer solely constructing with physical materials. He was now building something intangible yet profoundly significant, something enduring, a narrative, a testament, a spiritual testament. He referred to it as the final layer. Isabel discovered this title, hastily scribbled in the corner of the back cover one evening while she was tidying the bench. She posed the question to him regarding its meaning. "The church has its roof," he replied gently. "But faith always necessitates one more layer." By the middle of September, Joseph was no longer capable of traversing the entire path to the altar. Isabel would convey him halfway by vehicle, and he would then proceed the remainder of the distance with the assistance of a cane that had been anonymously left near the statue of Mary, inscribed with the words, "The man who never faltered." He chuckled upon encountering this inscription. "They never witnessed the bruises," he quipped, "but it's acceptable. At times, conviction requires a touch of embellishment." He continued his writing until the very last page was filled. The concluding sentence read, "This altar was not erected to venerate me. It was established to remind you that she remains present. That is sufficient." That evening he closed the notebook and presented it to Isabel without any fanfare. There were no pronouncements, no final goodbyes, merely a nod and a quiet instruction. "Ensure the last page is not misplaced." She held it with immense care, as if it were fragile glass. By this juncture, even the wind seemed to adopt a gentler tone when in Joseph's vicinity. The sun descended more leisurely over the horizon as he sat beneath the chapel's cross. Birds would perch nearer to him. Strangers would offer him water without being asked. He spoke very little in his final days. Yet, within the stillness he left behind, the town of Las Pedras began to discern something more profound. Not a sermon, nor a directive, but a message imprinted in ink, breath, stone, and sinew. That even when the physical form weakens, the spirit retains its capacity to create. And Joseph Martinez continued to build, word by word. It occurred without incident, precisely as everyone in Las Pedras had implicitly anticipated. No alarms blared, no urgency ensued, no dramatic final pronouncements were made, only tranquility and a serene smile. The preceding night, Joseph Martinez had requested his children to join him on the porch. Isabel and Mateo, now grown and accustomed to their father's decelerated pace, sensed an underlying shift. He was attired in his favored flannel shirt, the blue one his wife used to press meticulously before Sunday Mass, and he had illuminated a solitary candle near the altar in their front garden. The flame danced erratically against the desert breeze but remained steadfast. Joseph uttered very few words. He simply sat between them, gazing towards the constellations, his cane resting against his knee. The cherished, worn photograph of Our Lady of Guadalupe was held gently in one hand. Following a prolonged silence, he turned his attention to Isabel. "Do you recall the notebook?" he inquired. She offered a nod, her eyes welling with tears. Open it someday when you find yourself in need of renewed belief, not in me, but in what sustained me. Mateo, ever the quiet observer, rested his head upon his father's shoulder, and Joseph remained unmoving. He simply sat there, stable, absorbing the warmth emanating from the two individuals who had been his anchors after his fall. Later that evening, he asked Isabel to leave the window slightly ajar to allow the wind to enter. She responded with a gentle smile and complied. In the early hours, just before dawn, Joseph peacefully passed away in his sleep, as if returning to a place he had always known awaited him. Isabel discovered him at sunrise. He lay in his bed, one hand resting over his heart, the other still cradling the familiar photograph, its edges frayed, mended with tape, and imbued with such love as to render it sacred. Tears did not immediately fall. Instead, a profound stillness settled over the household, as if time itself had momentarily paused. Isabel gently covered him with a blanket, then knelt beside the bed, whispering a single word, "Gracias." Not goodbye, nor why, simply thank you. News of Joseph's departure reached the town before midday. The residents did not congregate in the streets weeping or expressing audible lamentation. Instead, they walked with a hushed solemnity, a deliberate slowness, towards the altar he had lovingly constructed with his hands and his heart. Louis was among the first to arrive, bearing a new notebook and a writing instrument. Father Thomas followed, carrying fragrant incense within the time-worn wooden crucifix from the church's original altar. Others joined them. Educators, mechanics, farmers, adolescents, elderly women clutching rosaries and walking aids, and even the mayor, impeccably dressed in his Sunday attire. They found themselves at a loss for words, so most remained silent. They proceeded to arrange candles around the altar, place floral tributes upon the bricks, and rest hands on each other's shoulders in a gesture of shared solace. He did not merely stumble and survive, Father Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible to anyone in particular. He rose so that we might remember how to humble ourselves. That evening, Isabel opened the notebook for the first time since her father had entrusted it to her. The final page, inscribed in a hand that was shaky yet discernible, read, "If the initial fall was an act of mercy, then let this final repose be into her embrace." She carefully transcribed this sentiment onto a small wooden marker and placed it beside the altar the following morning. Joseph's final resting place was unadorned by marble monuments or eloquent eulogies. It was marked by a simple wooden cross accompanied by the gentle strains of a guitar playing a rendition of Maria, and a long procession of individuals who had not come due to obligation, but because they had been transformed. Some placed stones at the site, reminiscent of early Christian traditions. Others left written messages. Still others, like young Mateo, offered no words, merely a tender touch of the photograph before departing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a final, ethereal light pierced through the clouds. A mere sliver, yet it glowed with a golden, sharp, and warm luminescence. It descended directly upon the statue of Mary at the altar, resting momentarily as if a loving hand were placed upon her shoulder, and for a fleeting instant it appeared as though she was smiling. Joseph Martinez was not commemorated with a sculpted likeness, nor was a street named in his honor, nor did he achieve widespread acclaim through published works or sensational headlines. Yet his altar remained standing, and in that enduring presence there was an abundance of fulfillment. Following his departure, a curious phenomenon began to unfold in Las Pedras. People started making pilgrimages, not just from neighboring streets or towns, but from distant counties and even from out of state. Their destination was not the church edifice, which remained unfinished. They were drawn to the simple bench, the enduring bricks, and the altar situated at the crest of the hill, a place where the light seemed to bestow its blessings with a gentler touch. Some had heard accounts of the man who had survived a catastrophic fall. Others were told of a sanctuary where prayers seemed to carry a greater weight. but the majority arrived at the behest of a trusted acquaintance who simply whispered, "You truly must go." Every Sunday, fresh candles would appear at the altar, even before the sun had fully risen. Children would leave small notes, carefully sealed within plastic bags, containing earnest pleas. "Please grant my mother healing. Help me overcome my anger. Convey to Jesus that I am striving." Veterans would arrive in quiet contemplation, pausing for reflection before rendering a silent salute to the statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as if acknowledging a comrade who had always upheld their unwavering respect. A woman named Angela, who had been estranged from her sister for a decade, knelt and implored for the fortitude to initiate contact. A teenage boy, leaving his electronic smoking device beneath the bench, departed barefoot. A man in a business suit wept beside the bricks, his whispered confession of "forgive me," echoing, perhaps for the first time, with genuine sincerity. The altar offered no judgment. It simply persisted, a steadfast testament to Joseph's enduring spirit. Father Thomas commenced conducting services beside the altar on the final Saturday of each month. There were no amplification devices, no ostentatious displays, merely readings from Scripture, moments of prayer, and the communal sharing of communion, passed from hand to hand with gentle reverence. At the outset of each observance, he would place Joseph's notebook, now preserved within a protective glass enclosure near the statue, on a pedestal. Visitors would form an orderly queue, not to peruse its contents, but simply to offer a reverent touch, as if it still held the lingering warmth of the man who had meticulously penned its pages. "He did not build it for personal recognition," the priest would often remark. "He constructed it because he remembered what had rescued him, and in that act of remembrance, others, in turn, began to recall." Isabel and Mateo continued their weekly visits. Their offerings varied from bouquets of flowers to periods of shared silence, but always accompanied by a palpable sense of gratitude. Isabel maintained a second notebook, this one meticulously documenting the names of those who had left their personal narratives behind. One woman's entry conveyed, "I paused here with the intention of ending my life this very night. I did not." Another shared, "My infant was born 3 weeks prematurely. The attending nurse placed this image of the altar in my palm while I prayed. My child survived." None of these accounts were disseminated online. None were commercialized. Nevertheless, the significance of the altar grew with each passing month. Not in its physical dimensions, but in its profound impact. The integrity of the bricks remained uncompromised. The bench showed no signs of splintering. The statue, despite a visible chip at its base, remained undisturbed, even as the desert winds howled and the rains descended with considerable force that October. One day, Mateo, now a young man possessing his father's steadfast demeanor and his mother's serene composure, encountered a young girl drawing with chalk at the altar. He inquired about her name. She responded that it was inconsequential. Then, looking up at him, she asked, "Is it true that a man fell, but did not completely succumb?" Mateo contemplated this for a moment before nodding affirmatively. Indeed, he fell into something more potent than mere gravity. A smile graced her lips, and she then stood, placing a flower at the edge of the brickwork. No words were exchanged, yet her action conveyed everything. Over time, Joseph's name gradually receded from casual conversation. However, his presence never truly diminished. It resonated in the hushed reverence with which people articulated prayers they had previously hesitated to voice. In the gentle quietude that descended upon even the most boisterous children upon entering the altar's consecrated ground. In the profound sense of peace that enveloped individuals as they departed, not because their tribulations had been resolved, but because they had finally found a means to carry them. Joseph Martinez had never endeavored to establish a lasting legacy. He simply held on to his faith with such unwavering conviction that it enabled others to embrace it, and they did, gradually, one by one, brick by brick. Amen. In an era saturated with digital notifications and pervasive noise, when acts of wonder were frequently dismissed as mere fable and periods of quietude misinterpreted as absence, the solitary fall and the understated faith of one man left an indelible imprint beyond the reach of any digital tracking system. The altar, constructed by Joseph Martinez, continues to stand. It is not sheltered behind glass or encased in marble, nor is it situated within a grand cathedral adorned with stained glass windows and climate control. Instead, it rests beneath the boundless expanse of the open sky, caressed by the wind and kissed by the sun, in a humble, dusty corner of a small New Mexico township. There are no advertisements, no entrance fees, simply a weathered bench, a serene statue, and a narrative that individuals now carry with them like a cherished secret flame. Each week, new visitors arrive. A woman grappling with a diagnosis she's too fearful to articulate. A father burdened by photographs of a son who will never return. A man in a tailored suit still carrying the faint aroma of whiskey and unspoken regret. They approach in silence. They linger longer than they initially intended, and they depart transformed. One young person scribbled a message on the back of a discarded receipt and left it beneath a stone of the altar. I didn't believe in anything. I still don't know if I do, but today, I felt as though something believed in me. This is the kind of profound transformation that eludes viral trends but fundamentally reshapes lives. Local lore invariably flourishes with the passage of time. Some recount tales of Joseph Martinez witnessing a celestial light at the moment of his fall. Others suggest that an angelic hand lifted the protective tarp. Still others maintain that the mark on his chest, shaped precisely like the silhouette of the Virgin, was not a mere coincidence but a divine endorsement. However, those who knew him most intimately articulate it differently. He did not fall into a miraculous event, Father Thomas once confided to a visiting clergyman. He fell with unwavering faith, and the miracle followed. It was a testament not to dramatic spectacle, but to enduring resilience. Not intended for adoration, but for observation, not destined for the front pages, but for the depths of the heart. Years later, the church building was finally brought to completion. Its stained glass windows were meticulously restored, its bell tower rebuilt, and its roof fortified against the relentless desert winds. Nevertheless, the majority of visitors continue to gravitate towards the brick altar situated at the periphery of the hill. It is a place where the atmosphere feels gentler, where the relentless march of time seems to decelerate. Here, abstract concepts such as hope, grace, and mercy resonate less as doctrinal pronouncements and more as essential elements for survival. Isabel, now a mother herself, brings her young son every Sunday. She allows him to run freely along the gravel pathways barefoot, then kneels with him before the statue, sharing, "This is where your grandfather encountered Mary." Mateo, who typically exhibits a reserved demeanor in public, now guides contemplative groups, comprising veterans, students, and couples navigating difficulties, sharing his father's narrative not with dramatic flair, but with quiet dignity. Within the local educational institution, a novel elective course has quietly been introduced: Community and Faith, chronicling the history of Las Pedras. Instruction is delivered not through examinations, but through the open sharing of journals and periods of profound introspection. As night descends and solitude prevails, the solar-powered lanterns illuminate the area surrounding the altar. They cast elongated shadows that gracefully stretch across the weathered bricks. Whispers abound of perceived movement, akin to a solitary figure seated quietly on the bench, seemingly absorbed in attentive listening. A wind chime, installed nearby by a child with autism, emits an unscripted melody in the absence of any human presence. Yet each time its notes resonate, the local birds fall silent, as if also engaged in attentive listening. One might label it as folklore or perhaps mere happenstance. However, in the fabric of contemporary America, where skepticism frequently supplants unwavering belief, an undeniable essence persists here. It resides not within the foundational bricks, nor even within the sculpted statue, but within the profound reality that countless individuals have arrived laden with burdens, fractured in spirit and in search of solace, only to depart standing taller, feeling lighter, and profoundly seen. It was not Joseph's survival of his fall that precipitated a transformation in Las Pedras. Rather, it was his earnest and heartfelt response to having been saved. He did not raise his voice in a clamor of proclamation. He did not engage in public exhortation. He did not erect imposing barriers. He simply created a sanctuary for expressing his profound gratitude. And as a direct consequence of his actions, the world, piece by piece, prayer by prayer, began to recollect its capacity for doing so. Therefore, should your travels ever lead you past an arid hillside in southern New Mexico, and you happen upon a modest clearing furnished with a stone bench, a solitary statue, and conspicuously lacking any outward signage, I implore you to pull over. Take a seat and simply engage in listening. You may not perceive spoken words, but you might discern something far more profound. The kind of profound stillness wherein faith continues to communicate. And, in modern America, that is indeed a miracle. If this narrative has resonated deeply within your heart, we kindly request your assistance in disseminating it across the globe. Please signify your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to Touched by Grace for further narratives that serve to rekindle your faith, one soul at a time.